Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the AfghanEye podcast. My name is Sangar Paikar. On this fourth episode, we have a special guest, Mr. Wahed Faqiri, who is a renowned Afghan author and political analyst. And we will be talking to Mr. Faqiri about Afghanistan's current affairs. Along with me is my co-host, Ahmed-Waleed and Sangar. First of all, Mr. Faqiri, welcome to our podcast. Thank you very much for giving us your time so that we can talk to you about our current state of affairs in Afghanistan.
Thank you, Mr. Paikar, and thank you, Mr. Kakar. It is really an honor, and also I'm very grateful to both of you for providing this opportunity, this platform, to exchange our ideas, to talk about the most current affairs, the current issues of Afghanistan. I think it is a very sensitive time. It is an important time for the Afghans, whether they are inside or outside, to talk about these issues and to exchange and also to provide a different perspective on these issues. Thank you again.
Okay, first of all, I would like to ask Ahmed-Waleed, because he has prepared a few questions for you. So if you will go ahead, please.
Sure.
I can't hear you.
I can't hear you.
Sorry, I accidentally muted myself. Sorry about that, guys. So Faqiri Saib, I mean, you're obviously quite popularly followed on social media, and in Afghan politics, that comes with a lot of controversy. So, what's your sort of personal background? Why would you say you sort of started in terms of coming to being sort of a political analyst and living as an Afghan in the United States?
I should start from the very beginning when I came to the United States, or even before that. I think the Soviet invasions, from the Russian invasion or the Soviet invasions, somehow shook me, really. It was a big shock for all of us, not just for me, but for the entire Afghan community. It was we were living in a bubble, some kind of a very quiet, very peaceful Afghanistan. That shock came suddenly and very forcefully and very violently, and of course it awakened me and awakened the entire nations, and it dawned on me, or it forced me to think why the Russian invaded Afghanistan. What was their main objective? Why did they came to Afghanistan? So that search, that quest, led me to politics, to political affairs, to political thoughts, to international relationship. And then I, of course, migrated to Pakistan and went to Germany for a while. And then at that time, West Germany, Germany.
Of course.
And then I migrated or came to United States in 1983. And I lived here a few years as a young man, as they say, clueless, as a young man. And then went to school, put myself here to school and college, and study political science at George Mason University, and also at American University, where I received my MA. So, that's my background, my somehow steeped or immersed in politics and political affairs. And of course, Afghanistan as our country, as our birthplace, as they say, it always attracts you, the place where you were born, where the feeling, those inner forces always attracts back to to the beginning where you were born. And plus, I think Afghanistan also is a very unfortunate place. It is the only place, I think, in history that been invaded by two superpowers in the course of 30 years. And this is really unprecedented. I really don't find any other country being faced with such a great, the most powerful nations invaded a very small, poor, defenseless nations without any justifications. So that's.
And speaking of invasion, whatever, I mean, you haven't been sort of immune from controversy and sort of criticizing the U.S. invasion, or I don't know what the correct terminology to use it. Do we call it an occupation or troop presence or humanitarian mission? But you haven't been immune to that sort of criticism. So, I mean, how would you say did you ever try to mince your words or try to be less blunt about it, or have you always been as strong in your opposition as you are now and prone to controversy?
No, to be honest with you, at the beginning of U.S. invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, I was optimistic, to tell you the truth. I thought the U.S. will bring stability. I thought the U.S. has no colonial design in Afghanistan. That somehow I also believe that the U.S. had some kind of justifications for invading Afghanistan, being attacked. The 9/11, the terrorist attack in 9/11. I was here in the United States in America. It was a very huge. Shock for the entire country or for the entire world. I mean, it was a huge thing.
I remember it as well.
Yes, I did believe that the United States had some justifications to go after those who attacked the United States at 9/11. So at the beginning, probably call me naive or whatever, that I was pro this, and I thought that since the U.S. has no colonial design in Afghanistan, this thing will turn positive for the Afghans. It will develop Afghanistan. It will bring stability. But slowly, when I went back to Afghanistan in 2007, I saw some indications, some signs that the things were not moving in the right directions.
So what would you say that you saw that sort of, made it clear to you that things weren't going as you would have hoped or you would have thought that they were going?
When I went to 2007 to Afghanistan, I traveled around. I traveled Kabul, Herat, in Ghazni. I traveled to these places. One thing that I would share with you is that when I traveled to Herat, we were coming back from Herat. We were coming back in public bus. I was trying to see what Afghanistan looked like.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. We were coming back to Kandahar, and we passed Grishk, which is very close to Kandahar, Helmand province. And from Grishk to Kandahar, our bus was stopped along the way too, but here it was stopped several places. And in each stop, the police would come and would take bribe from the bus drivers. And finally, the bus driver couldn't take it anymore. And he turned, when he gave his bribe to the police officer, he turned around and addressed the entire passengers and told us that he has been traveling on the same road when Taliban were in power, when the Mujahideen were in power. Now the new government is in power. That during the Taliban times, he said, he would take one ticket from Herat and he would go all the way to Kabul, and that ticket or that permission or permit was sufficient. No one else would stop him along the way to take bribe from him. But now under the democratic government, so-called democratic government, under the U.S. watchful eyes, he paid like probably 15, 20 times along the way to get to Kandahar. And he said that that I hope that the Taliban will come back and take. So when I heard that bus driver, and the bus driver was from Herat. His thick Herati's accent was very obvious for everyone. So when I heard that, it really shocked me. I saw some other signs here, there too, but this signs was from the public, from the bottom up. The signs that people were dissatisfied. People were trying to express their dissent, and that really shocked me. The other episode or the event that I want to share with you is I went to Ghazni, and the governor was a friend of mine. He invited me and he said, "Come to Ghazni. We will, stay with me for a while."
Was it Sher Khusti?
No, at that time was Patan.
Oh, okay.
So,
Patan, yes.
Patan.
Okay.
He was a friend of mine. He was in the United States. We were friends here, and then he went back to Afghanistan, and then he became the governor of Ghazni. I went to his to stay a few days with him, and one day we were coming from his office back to his home. And when we reached his home, the American soldiers there was a group of American soldiers in his house, in his residence. He stopped us and he told the governor that since we didn't have I didn't have an official position, that they wanted to search me if I had a gun. So we were two of us. We came down. The American soldier searched us, and when I saw such a humiliations, in the governor car when we were driving with the governor, being searched in front of him, a governor, and a governor doesn't have the right to say, "No, these are my guests, and I would not allow you to do this." I thought that now thing has changed into an occupations. It is not international helpers or international friends or partners.
Humanitarian mission.
That's gone. It is really a brutal occupations. So, these kind of things that, and again, when I went to 2010, I think, and then I really, this idea became more matured, I should say, I reached to a conclusion that yes, it has turned into an occupation.
If I may add another point, is that you have a background in political science, so maybe you can explain this. When the United States, their forces, when they invaded Afghanistan, there were a lot of war crimes committed in the early stages. There were bombings, there were people prosecuted and imprisoned, and up until today, there are many instances of injustice, war crimes basically committed. These people, especially the Western troops who have entered Afghanistan, they are not being prosecuted by the Afghan legal system. So if they are not being prosecuted, is it fair to say that this is another clear indication that the government has no authority or sovereignty, and this is another evidence of the fact that Afghanistan is occupied?
Of course, I believe that this is a very strong indication that Afghanistan is an occupied land where the government has no right. Its sovereignty has been violated several times. every day, on the daily basis, the sovereignty of Afghans are being violated. Afghan has no right, no sovereignty over their land, their air. The entire Afghanistan is under U.S. Surveillance. The night raids that are going on for the past several years, since then, is a clear violations of international laws, of Afghan sovereignty, and of humanitarian laws. When you go to someone's house without his or her consent, that's a violation. When you go at night, and it has been repeated time and time again, the civilian casualty. There are several, even the international justice, the court, in Hague, they are now trying to investigate these war crimes committed by the American forces in Afghanistan. So these are all, these comes together. The government that was formed, our previous government was formed in the embassy of the United States. It was formed there. That's really a big violation. So there, I believe, for now, for Afghans to deny that Afghanistan is not occupied by the United States is just an illusion. I think, we are trying to fool ourselves. Even the Americans themselves now saying, yes, we are as occupied, and that's something that the Afghans should discuss, should talk about it, and should point it out. I know this notions of calling the United States as an occupier is very controversial here. You are not allowed to say this. You really, this is a word that is taboo. It's really taboo in the United States press, in the corporate press, among the Afghans. This is taboo. You shouldn't say this. So there is you should always say that we are very glad that you are here. You are our partner. We are so glad, we are so happy or glad to be killed by you. It is an honor to be killed by you. This is, Afghan, they don't give us the right to say that we have human rights. Afghans have human rights, they have dignity, they have honor, and they shouldn't be treated like this. You guys, if you go to Afghanistan, if there is a U.S. military convoy moving through a city or an area, the entire Afghan has to stop and stay by the road and allow them to go. If they go close there, they will shoot. They will be killed.
I saw that. I've seen that with my own eyes.
I've seen it as well. I was visiting Afghanistan in 2012, so I believe, don't take me 100%, but I believe this is when troops were being drawn down. I was in Kandahar quite a lot as well, where the Americans were very much prominent. And I used to see not just sort of the massive amounts of space the American convoys would take up, but mixture, not just of fear, but just of dislike amongst, the locals, just there was I was 17, so my sort of political awareness and consciousness was not as much as I would have liked it to be, but you don't need to be politically conscious to feel what's in the air, the general sentiment, and it's a really ugly mixture of fear, of dislike, of mutual suspicion. I saw that as well. It's definitely.
Faqiri Saib, if I may, you said that it is a taboo to say that Afghanistan is occupied, and you said that in the corporate media it is not done to speak about the American engagement in Afghanistan in those terms. But let me play the role of the advocate of the devil. We could say that, we have a government, we have elections, and the Afghan government wants the foreign forces to be present in the country, and the United Nations agreed that Afghanistan should be invaded and occupied. So there is a consensus of the international community in the shape of a agreement
UN
of the UN resolutions, yes. And the Afghan government, we have elections, we have a parliament, and they don't seem to be against foreign presence. So this can't be an occupation. How would you respond to that?
Well, I mean, I know these argument. There are this argument, and some are valid. There are some valid points in it. Particularly referring to UN resolutions. But the reality should speak for itself. When we talk about these incidents or these, when the Afghans' homes are violated, when they are constantly being bombarded day and night, when their government is formed in the U.S. Embassy.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. You mentioned that before. Could you please clarify what you mean that the government was formed in the U.S. Embassy?
I mean, in 2014, when we had the elections, everyone, according to every estimate, it was the most corrupt, faked elections in the history. I mean, it went on and on and on, and then the U.S. sent Secretary of State John Kerry to go, and then finally they form a government of national unity, which violated the Afghan constitution, the constitution that they own wrote. There is nothing in that post. There was nothing in that post in the Afghan constitutions. So, and then now this election, the election that we had just the last elections, we have two presidents now. I mean, officially we have two presidents. It went on for 6 or 5 months. The result was not known to us. So I think these elections undermined the democratic process more than the oppositions, more the extremists. I think the Americans, the so-called Afghan government, have been undermining democracy and the rule of law more than anyone else. I mean, the way they are providing ammunitions to the extremists. When you violate the basic principles of democracy, I mean, what do you expect? Where is the legitimacy in it?
So, Faqiri Saib, in your opinion, you mentioned the violation of democratic principles. You mentioned fraudulent elections, but obviously, someone from the government is not going to say that officially anyways, they're not going to acknowledge that 2014 elections were rigged or fraudulent. What other violations of the democratic process or principles would you say sort of come foremost to your mind?
Most importantly is the cherishing of warlords in Afghanistan. I mean, throughout this 20 years, the most despicable Afghan personality has been cherished by the United States. Drug lords, mafia, murderers, the Afghans, the most notorious personality in Afghanistan. When superpower, so-called superpower that proclaims to be on the side of democracy and the rule of law, standing behind or backing the most notorious people in Afghanistan, that is undermining the democracy. That is really undermining the rule of law, the idea of having people who has to be accountable to the society. These we have Dostam, we have Sayaf, we have Muhakkik, we have America brought the entire Afghan warlords back into life. They were dead. Most of them were dead. Most of them were finished. But somehow America revived them. So when the Afghans see such a thing, they automatically lose confidence. They lose confidence in democracy, in the rule of law, in the promises that America or the international community are promising.
No, I mean, if I may, speaking of devil's advocate here, and this is because this is sort of a view, now this is the view that I've sort of been inclined towards in the past as well. So, amongst a lot of supporters of President Ghani, right, especially his campaign was state builder, right, and the idea and the sort of the idea that's put forward is that we need a strong centralized government under someone like President Ghani to exile and to marginalize the warlords. And the president, a supporter of President Ghani will say something like, and once again, I was inclined toward this view at one point as well, that, Dostum was sent into exile under Ghani's time, under Ghani's presidency. Ustad Atta Mohammed Noor was forced to resign, even if not willingly, he was forced to resign. So there are a few examples we could say of President Ashraf Ghani marginalizing some warlords. And so what would you say sort of in response? Because, I mean, there is a very much an undercurrent of hostility to warlords amongst sort of President Ghani's supporters and in his speeches and, the PR team, if you will.
Well, I think if we see his the past 5 years, in his first 5 years, Dostum was his first vice president. Muhakkik was with him, and he didn't prosecute one warlord, in his entire 5 years of term, and they become more stronger, I believe, under his rule. Now, because most of these warlords are getting old. Now their sons and daughters are becoming the mini warlords,
Warlords are there. Warlords are there.
Warlords are there.
Warlords, eh?
So I think, there is this ruling elite that now rule Afghanistan with the help of the United States Army forces. They really don't have any deep division among themselves. They are united, I think.
Yeah, you were speaking about warlords that they may have some differences about minor issues with one another, but on major issues they are united. Can you proceed?
Yeah, I think in the past 20 years, in the past 20 years, there is a ruling class or ruling elite that are allied with the U.S. and they probably have some division among themselves over some resources, some government positions here and there. But on the whole, I think they are one. Their interests are one, and they form unitary ruling elite, as they call it. So, in the past 20 years that we have seen, one become governor, then he become minister, then he goes back as a governor, he comes back as a minister. They are just recycling each other's, recycling over time. And you don't see any new blood, any new people in that circle. That circle is very restricted, exclusive, because they don't want to share the resources or the position with other segment of the society. And one of the most should I say the most restrictive circle I have seen in politics is the Afghan circle, the Afghan ruling elites. That in the past 20 years they haven't been able to attract other segments of society into the ruling elites in order to widen their circle, in order to become more legitimate in the eyes of the Afghans. So that's one reason why they are so isolated. When you go to Afghanistan, you don't see the ruling elites. They are behind their concrete walls, their homes. They mingle among themselves, and
they intermarry. They intermarry with one another.
Yeah. And they do not even interact with their own people. And one other thing that for the occupation, when we're talking about the occupation, is that these Afghan elites do not feel responsible to the Afghans. They don't feel any responsibility toward the Afghans. Their main focus is how to keep the United States happy, how to keep Washington happy. If Washington is happy, they don't care what North thinks, South thinks, or the West Afghanistan or the Afghans are gentle. They really don't even bother to investigate how the Afghan feelings are, because they are focused on how to keep Washington happy.
If I may, you said that 20 years ago or so, almost 20 years now, the United States, when they decided to invade Afghanistan, they empowered the warlords. The thing is that when 9/11 happened, the United States decided to attack Afghanistan, but as a country, we were devastated, weak. There were no political institutions, there were no political parties, there were no movements that enjoyed widespread support among the people of the common people. There were no grassroots movements. So would you say that the international community, under the leadership of the United States, they didn't have any alternatives? They didn't know who else could assist them, so they were forced to rely on these warlords?
Well, I think I respectfully disagree with that. With that notion, because when the United States came to Afghanistan, these guys were almost nobody. They were either in Turkey, or either in Tajikistan, or Iran, or Pakistan, or in the West, someplace they were hiding. They're hiding someplace. So they really didn't have any strong grassroots support among the Afghans. What the United States should have done is to allow other Afghans in Afghanistan to join the government. But even when you study the compositions of bond agreement, or those who went to the bond to Germany, and that circle was very restrictive. As you know, Sattar Sirat was excluded, even though he won more votes than Hamid Karzai. But since the United States wanted Hamid Karzai, they imposed Hamid Karzai on Afghans. So the United States really manipulated the Afghan political setups. They invested, they empowered the people who they really wanted to be in power. Even in the United States, among the Bush administration's top leadership, there was a disagreement that the Northern Alliance should not be allowed to occupy Kabul. Kabul should be a demilitarized zone, and then the Afghans should be allowed to form an inclusive government. But I think there was a strong push from the military, from the CIA, to bring these people into Afghanistan and to empower them, to make them stronger. There was really no need for it, really. But in terms of politics, in terms of grassroots support, there was no really a need for these people to be back in power. They were hated us, all Afghans would agree that these guys were the most despised people in Afghanistan. They were the instigator of civil war. They committed a lot of atrocities. In the United States, when the Afghans realized that the United States brought them back, the United States lost credibility among the Afghans, among the Afghan populations.
I want to interject here. So, I've got another question, but sort of, you mentioned that if you want the military dimension of the administration, so the Pentagon and the CIA, they were more keen on using or allying or partnering with the Northern Alliance. Do you think they had are there any other ulterior motives we could say that were there that maybe, were not as apparent at the time or even now, but that we could speculate, were motivating the encouragement to get in bed with the Northern Alliance?
Well, I think the Northern Alliance, they were anti-Taliban, of course. The Taliban America defeated the Taliban. So these guys were their enemy, and they could be manipulated very easily. That was also one considerations. And plus, I think, these guys, the United States really didn't, from the beginning, we were naive probably to believe that that they should do this for the Afghans, they should do that for the Afghans because this is the right policy. Probably we were naive. I think we Afghans, we believe that the United States has, has no colonial design in Afghanistan. It should have been done much better than the Russian, than the British. But one thing that really I should point out is that the United States looked at Afghanistan very simplistically. Okay. Their entire policy was very simplistic and somehow revengeful. There was a sense of revenge in the United States. 9/11 provoked the revenge of the United States. And since, they wanted to revenge 9/11, and they wanted to find a scapegoat for that revenge. They have to beat beat someone. They had to smash someone, heads. And these Afghans, these rural Afghans who looked like Taliban, who spoke like Taliban, they were the easy target.
And speaking of the Bonn Conference and the constitutional arrangements that were made there in, I think it was 2002. Was it 2002, Sangar?
Yes.
2001 or 2002?
2001, right? 2002.
Now, obviously, I was too young to sort of remember or even know what a constitution is or what a conference is. But reading back, there's an indication that there was a lot of support for the restoration of the monarchy. Zahir Shah was still alive, and we could say, I mean, we can't obviously use polling data to go to Afghanistan, but it seems that there was a strong segment of society across different ethnicities, across different political groupings, to see Zahir Shah restored, maybe not as the head of an absolute monarchy, but sort of a constitutional monarchical arrangement. Why did that not come to fruition, and we ended up with Zahir Shah just on the floor above Hamid Karzai in the Ark? What are the reasons for that?
First, I think Zahir Shah was too old back then. Even it was back then. I think he was 88 or 89 years old.
Okay.
And Zahir Shah, even when he was the king of Afghanistan, he was not a very active king. He didn't want to manage the day-to-day affairs of the Afghan state. And I think he really didn't have that desire to be at the top. Yes, there were people around him who wanted him to be at the top so they can get the most of the state. But there was, his group was included in that arrangement. Karzai was in his group, some others were in group, they were included. But the real problem with the Bonn conference and with all that setup was that it allowed some defeated, some spent forces to revive and to come back and to gain the trust of the United States and the CIA and others, these warlords, these guys who destroyed Kabul, who killed thousands of people in Afghanistan, and who were despised by the majority of Afghans. And with bringing them back, the United States lost a lot of credibility, lost the Afghan hearts and minds, and paved the way for today's disaster. We cannot separate these two things together. The root of America's failures started in Bonn in 2002 and 2003. Since then, it was going down. It's going down and going down, and empowering these guys, excluding the Afghans, the most Afghans, young, educated, relying on warlords, then on many warlords. All these things, really undermine U.S. credibility, the international credibility in Afghanistan.
But wouldn't you say that, obviously, I would take the point, right, that there was a crisis of legitimacy from the inception of a new government in Kabul. There's been a crisis of legitimacy it suffered from. But wouldn't you say that sort of elections in 2004, obviously in the recent election, turnout was very low. But wouldn't you say that was sort of an enthusiasm for a democratic project in Afghanistan based off the high voter turnouts of, the 2004 elections, 2009, even if those were rigged? We can say with some degree of accuracy that there was a lot of the voter turnout was, quite strong in many areas.
I do agree that in the first elections there was a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of support for the new government. You would remember that since 2005, Afghanistan was peaceful. Fighting was, some places here and there you would see some attack here and there, but till 2005-06, things were going in the right directions, or at least the Afghan perceptions was that the things were going in the right direction. But after that, when the Afghans saw no improvement, when the Afghans saw that the warlords, the corrupts are getting stronger, people turn to the Taliban.
Okay.
People start saying stuff. The thing that the driver that I mentioned before,
The
Yes.
angry Hirati driver.
the Iraqi, people were starting questioning the entire episode or the entire thing. And then we through these years, through even 7 and 8. America has started bombing Afghanistan more and more because opposition was growing, more and more, jailing, imprisoning more Afghans and more, humiliating Afghans on the daily basis. Pulitzer, he was growing, Bagram was growing, Guantanamo was growing. All these things together, corruption was growing. The corruption was growing. So these different elements together made the Afghans believe that this thing is not working anymore, that this is not for them, that there is a sinister, a vicious design behind this. So people turned to the Taliban, and Taliban became stronger and stronger. By 2008, 9, they became, by 2009 and 10, they become so strong that the Obama administration started to open talks with them, in Qatar.
The surge in Arghandab and those areas as well. There was a lot of fighting. I remember that as well. So so you would say that just as sort of you were taken, you sort of described as naivety as to sort of being enthusiastic and hopeful about the approach. You'd say that sort of started to dip and the lid was lifted on what became apparently an occupation sort of in the 2006-7 period, right?
Yes, I think so, yes. And one other thing I also have to mention is that historically, Afghans are opposed to occupations. Afghans are opposed to foreign forces in their land. This is a trait, a characteristic of Afghan history. So the more the U.S. send troops into Afghanistan, the opposition group,
the more it reinforces the opposition. Yeah. I remember this is because I've always been sort of interested in politics. I remember in sort of I was about 14, 15. You'd read the newspapers and it would give you like a massive section of sort of, this is how many British soldiers died. This is in the period when Musa Qala, in Helmand, a lot of British soldiers were dying. And at the same time, it would be like Obama's surge. And then a massive long column at the bottom, there would be a paragraph saying, the Taliban said, this is more prey for the lions. The more soldiers they send, it's more prey for us. It's... the thing is that if you said that back then, you would be accused of being a Taliban sympathizer, or whatever. It's taboo, like you said, but clearly the information that the Americans were getting is not 100% correct. Otherwise, things would have turned out differently.
I want to interject. The thing is that we are now currently in a situation where we had a negotiation and an agreement between the United States and the Taliban. They have spent almost 2 years drafting this document, and they have come to an agreement. They also have a support from the United Nations for this agreement. So after 19 years of mismanagement and bad policy, they have actually come full circle. They are now willing to negotiate and make a deal with the Taliban. And while this is happening, how do you explain the position of the current Afghan government? Why is it that the president of Afghanistan, the political...
One of the presidents.
Yes, the political
That's my favorite contribution.
the political elite in Afghanistan who have relied heavily on American aid and assistance for the last 19 years, they seem to somehow it seems like they're opposing what America wants from them. So they are now actually posturing as an independent state, as an independent country with its own will and its own agenda. How do you explain that? Well, how is that possible? So on the one hand, we say that yes, this government was created by the Americans, they were financed by the Americans, and now somehow when America wants the government to follow a new policy, the government is blocking it. It's still a mystery to a lot of people what is happening. Could you please explain what do you think is going on?
First of all, I do support the Qatar talks and agreement. I do support them. I think President Trump made a bold decision, and I think that neither Obama or Bush would have made these decisions. It is an unconventional decisions to go to the Taliban, to talk to them, to talk to Mullah Baradar. I mean, this is unusual stuff for him, and I do believe that this is a courageous movement from him, and I do support him on this. I do support also the notion that the entire U.S. forces should get out of Afghanistan. That it is better for the United States, it is better for the Afghans, and it is better for the region. If Afghanistan resume its national sovereignty, Afghanistan become sovereign and independent again, it is better for all of us, for the Afghans, for the region, and for the United States. I think the Americans' military involvement in Afghanistan is somehow outdated now, and it's ran out its usefulness. And so, on that issue, I want to make clear that I am in favor of this and I support this process. But coming to the next part of your questions, why is the Afghan government resisting or seems to resisting? My belief is that the Afghan or the ARC, this new elite, this ruling elite of Afghanistan, would do whatever it takes to keep the United States in Afghanistan militarily, to design obstacles, ways to keep the United States there. Because the ruling elite in Kabul do know that if the United States is not there, they are not there. That their survival, their government depends on these forces of occupations. When occupation is done, they are done as well. Either they have to go and form a government with the Taliban, share the government, or they will collapse. As Ghani himself stated very clearly that in 6 months his government will collapse. And I think even he exaggerated. Probably less than 6 months his government will collapse. But I don't see any resistance in their part. What I see is a way of creating obstacles, trying to maintain the status quo, trying to convince the United States to stay there. That they argue that if the United States pull out, Al-Qaeda will return, Daesh will return, terrorism will return, and that it will endanger the United States. But even on the issue of peace process, I mean, the ARG is very opposed to the peace process.
Yeah.
First, because ARG is excluded. I mean, this is an extreme humiliation for ARG, being excluded from the peace process, a peace process that the United States, their main backer, went to the Taliban and sat down with the Taliban and signed a peace agreement. And this is a kind of giving the Taliban legitimacy, not just local legitimacy, but international legitimacy to the Taliban. When the U.S. President Trump calls Mullah Baradar, this is really serious thing. See, when Pompeo, he gets nothing in Kabul and he goes straight to Qatar and talk to Mullah Baradar and says, yes, they are fulfilling their promises. They are doing fine with the agreement. This has a very strong message for the Afghan government. I think that the Kabul is very nervous, extremely nervous, that the United States will leave them alone. My belief is, it's probably a little bit conspiracy in it. My belief is that the United States and the Taliban are probably forming an agreement behind those doors. That the United States will open the door for the Taliban, and the Taliban will do three things for the United States: eliminate Daesh, cut off all their relation with Al-Qaeda, and end drugs. And I think these are the most important things for the United States.
Funnily enough, they're all things that the Taliban can easily achieve as well.
Yes, exactly. Yes. These are the things that they have shown that they can do it.
But would you say that the president, one of the presidents of Afghanistan and his circle, would you say that his concern and the concern of his supporters and maybe people in Hudson Institute and the people of FDD, Foundation for Defending Democracies, the ones who are very critical of the peace agreement with the Taliban, would you say that they are right and they have a valid and legitimate concern when they say that if the United States pulls out, women will be stoned and there will be burqa everywhere and women's education will be banned and Afghanistan will go back to the Stone Ages? Are these concerns valid and legitimate? Do you agree with them, or do you think that they are gross exaggerations?
I think there is a fear, that all Afghans, including myself, you, and everyone who cares for Afghanistan, this fear, this anxiety is within us because we came out from a bad experience. I mean, we saw the Civil War, we experienced the Civil War, we experienced stoning, we experienced bombing, so this is a legitimate concern for most of us. But what I see is, Mr. Sangar, is that I see a different Afghanistan today. Today's Afghanistan is fundamentally different than the Afghanistans of 1994 or 1995. I see middle class is growing. I see the educated population is growing. I see economically Afghanistan is growing. Cities are growing tremendously. And I also believe that the young Afghans would not allow such a brutality, such a tyranny, tyrannical state And I also believe that right now we have international support, which we didn't have in 1990s. The U.S. is involved, the international community is involved. The third thing is that I think the Taliban are not the same Taliban as they were in the 1990s. I think there is some change in them, as their statements are suggesting. The talk that they went, they believe in diplomacy. That when they decided to talk to the United States and sign an agreement with the United States, it means something. That they have realized that they cannot do it alone. That they have to have international legitimacy. I mean, without international legitimacy, without international helps, they know. Even Haqqani, when he wrote an article in the New York Times, he stated this issue that we need foreign aids. Yeah. We need America to help us to rebuild Afghanistan. Yeah. So even those people who the West in their mass media, the corporate media, has portrayed them as a terrorist, as a hardliner, as a militant, something. Even they are saying that we need cooperations, we need international relations, we need to talk to you. So I think there is the Taliban, the change in the Taliban, the change in the Afghan societies, the globalizations. I mean. Yes. Back in 2000, in the 1990s, we couldn't talk to each other as we do today.
Yes, exactly. And there is one other point that I would like to make. The fact that the Taliban have a past where they have used brutality is constantly repeated as an argument against any peace agreement with the Taliban. But what I personally think about this specific line of reasoning is the following. You see, during the 90s, before the emergence of the Taliban as a movement, I'm actually from Kabul, I lived in Kabul during the Soviet years, so I saw Kabul before it was destroyed, and when the civil war started, and when these different groups, when they started raping women, murdering them, yes. These people who are now talking about human rights and international agreements, they would go from one neighborhood to the other, and they would rape their women. They would kill them. They would put their prisoners in containers and burn those containers. They would behead people. I'm sorry that I have to mention this, but this is actually documented. It's a fact. People from Kabul, they have seen this with their own eyes. There are people right now who are heads of human rights organizations in Afghanistan who used to be part of Hizb Wahdat. Yes. And Hizb Wahdat is the party that made something that was unheard of in the entire history of Afghanistan, with something that is called Raqs Murda, the dance of the dead. What they would do, they would behead their prisoners and pour cooking oil or hot boiling oil on their heads, so that right after the head is removed, the body starts shaking, and they would record that and make videos, and those videos were being distributed. Some people still have copies of those videos. People who made those videos, they travel now around the world. They attend international conferences. They talk about human rights and education and tolerance, but they were not prosecuted. None of them were prosecuted, and nobody even mentions this. So, so on one hand, we're talking about the Taliban as an evil boogeyman that cannot be trusted. But on the other hand, in Kabul, we have people who have done these things, and they're still free. They're allowed to do whatever they want, and nobody's prosecuting them, and nobody's even mentioning this. they don't even want to talk about this. So somehow it is possible for them to be rehabilitated. It's possible for these warlords, for these various groups who have committed most horrific crimes. It is for them possible to be rehabilitated and to be accepted by the international community, by the media, by the commentators. But for the Taliban, it's not possible. I see a clear bias. I see a politically motivated agenda, and they are trying to say that everyone else, regardless of their crimes, they can be rehabilitated, but these people can't. And why is that? Why? How would you explain that? Why is it that?
I would just interject quickly. I was thinking the exact same thing in 2014 when Gulbuddin Hekmatyar came back to Kabul. It's okay for the 2002 gang, if you will. All of whom fought against each other brutally. You know, these crimes that Sangar just mentioned, these war crimes, the 2002 gang were committing these against each other in large measure. Not a pipsqueak. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar came back. Butcher of Kabul, Rocketeer, and all of that stuff. And once again, if there was consistency, if there were to be consistency and we were to take the same approach with all of the Rocketeers of Kabul, not just Gulbuddin, I wouldn't have a problem with that. But, you know, almost immediately, the bearded turban boogeyman came back. You know, so, we're seeing the same thing, the history sort of repeating itself.
But Faqiri Sahib, I would really like to hear from you. Why do you think that this is the case? Why?
Well, as we talked about it previously, it is the media, or the dominant American media, the corporate media, that can overnight turn a person into an angel or into a demon. If, you know, these, the New York Times, the Washington Post, you know, the Wall Street Journal, these powerful corporate medias, they go hand in hand with the American administrations. If the American administrations want to whitewash a person, revitalize it, you know, revive it, they would go hand in hand with the American administrations.
Yeah, definitely.
This is the corporate media. You know, they can form perceptions. They can bring new perceptions. You know, we call it in Farsi masmali. You know, they can make it masmali. A person, you know, become a Democrat in overnight. Overnight, a person become a Democrat. He will wear a suit, he will wear a tie, and he will become clean. No one will say a thing about him anymore. I mean, just today or yesterday, the New York Times published a report on Nahid, on Makroyan and Kabul, and how these warlords went. They say Mujahideen, but the New York Times did not allow itself to say Masood's people went there. Fahim went there and tried to rape Nahid, and she jumped from it. So I would say that this is because the need for independent media, for an alternative media, for an alternative perspective on these issues, this narrative, this dominant narrative has to be challenged. These are wrong narratives that the U.S. media, the dominant media, imposed on us, imposed on international opinion, that these are good guys. If you are with them, if you are following their footsteps, you are the good guys. If you object, as we do, we are the bad guys. We are the Taliban. We are the militant. We are the terrorists. You know, this is very. I mean, they do it intentionally. There's an intention in this. There is a design in this, as framing the discussions, trying to frame the discussions, not to allow any radical, as they call it, radical or something, perspective or idea that would challenge their dominant idea. That's the reason that most of us are out of mainstream media. The New York Times will not come and interview you or Mr. Carker or me. The New York Times will go and interview Amrullah Saleh, Khaled, Ghani, Atmar. I mean, these guys are the same. They have no different ideas. They have the same ideas. They want Americans to be there. They would say all rosy stuff about America, but they will never, the New York Times, the Washington Post, they will never come and interview us or take even a note from us.
Yeah. Because, Sangar, are you thinking what I'm thinking?
Yes, go ahead.
Faqiri Saib mentioned the need for truly free and independent media, and I was hoping that we've sort of got mental synergy, a bit of shameless self-promotion here, but this is exactly, for all the viewers out there, this is exactly that we at AfghanEye want to accomplish. If you have been called names or you have asked the wrong questions and your mind doesn't necessarily conform to the framework which Faqiri Saib discussed, then AfghanEye is what we're here for. We're aiming to grow this platform to discuss certain inconvenient facts and historical occurrences. So, yeah, I mean, that's, I hope Sangar was thinking along the same lines as myself.
But Faqiri Saib, maybe this is my personal observation. Do you think that there is a growing circle of Afghans, sort of dissidents of the Kabul elite, who are now sort of becoming more and more organized somehow by informal connections with one another to form a counter narrative to the Kabul elite? Do you think that this is now shaping at the moment, and if it is, are you optimistic about it, or do you have any special comments regarding this development?
When I talk to you, it really gave me energy and reinforce the idea that you can stifle a person, you can stifle a nation, but you cannot kill a nation. You cannot silence a nation forever. People like us, people like us will come up and represent a different perspective, a different narrative. What I really admire about social media, that it democratizes media.
True.
I think media was extremely monopolized, particularly the dominant media was extremely monopolized, and it did not allow any dissident voices to come up to challenge them. But now through this kind of social media that we have access to, we can challenge the dominant perceptions. We can challenge them up to their face, as they say, and we can represent our view. And they are scared to death from this kind of discussions. That, look, these Afghans are standing up to us. I mean, how could they do it? They have no right to stand up to us. They have no independent their power to think. They should follow our voice. When we tell them, they should follow. But now these young guys are coming up and challenging us. So I see, it's not just. I mean, this is one platform. I see this in the entire Afghan young communities, that they are tired of these dominant lies that the government regime in Kabul is feeding them, the dominant media is feeding them, the American corporate media is feeding them. They are really tired of this because there is nothing new in this. This is, old, dull, rusted vision that the Americans are trying to represent. These are the real issues that we are talking about. Go ahead, please.
No, so I mean, because we mentioned the New York Times and whitewashing, and a lot of the times the corporate media working hand in glove with the White House. So I mean, obviously, when Sirajuddin Haqqani, the deputy leader of the Taliban, wrote that op-ed, describing the Taliban stance, their philosophy and whatever, do you think we'll see more of that as the Taliban? I mean, I think everyone can observe here, over the last couple of years, they've been increasing in their international legitimacy. They send delegations to neighboring countries like Uzbekistan. They're received warmly in Pakistan. They have their political office in Qatar. Is this something that, the monopoly of the Kabul bubble, if you will, do you think that this is ending in the international media in general? Do you think we'll see more such opinion op-eds being published by reputable, world-renowned media organizations? Or do you think that the Taliban will still be perceived very much with hostility and this won't really materialize in the coming months and years?
I think the door is open, the door is opening up. There is more opportunity for a different perspective to be heard, because everyone in the United States political establishment now realize, even if they don't say it out loud, they know that there is a failure in Afghanistan. There is a strategic failure in Afghanistan, that they failed in Afghanistan, that their version is a bankrupt version, that their strategy is bankrupt in Afghanistan. So when you face such a glaring reality, you have to come up, you have to somehow reconcile yourself to it.
Yeah, definitely.
In the United States, the American media, the American political establishment is now seeing the light, as they say. Seeing the light, trying to realize the light, to realize this fact that yes, we failed, we cannot do the same thing over and over, that our propaganda, our manipulations is now over, it's not working anymore. So when you see these articles in New York Times. I mean, New York Times is an important paper in Africa, not just America, but
across the world.
Across the world. When you see this kind of articles coming in the New York Times, we should realize that the door is opening. That there is some opening up. That the American establishment is realizing that their lies, their deceptions is not working anymore. They have to come to terms with it.
Okay, all right. Mr. Faqiri, thank you very much for spending these hours with us and talking about current affairs. It is always a pleasure to speak to one of our elders, especially people with so much experience and a background in different time periods in Afghanistan. We would love to have you again as a guest in our show to discuss further more topics about Afghanistan's current affairs, and I am really happy to have this open dialogue with you, and I think it's very necessary for us to engage in these discussions more often, because as you have mentioned, there is a very strong narrative that needs to be challenged, and thankfully we have now the liberty and the opportunities to counter the narrative. So your contribution is appreciated. I'm really happy to have you as our guest, and maybe Ahmed-Waleed has some final comments as well.
No, to be honest, I mean, I completely agree with that entirely. It's definitely. I mean, so far we've had on the guests that we've had on the podcast have been younger, so it's quite a refreshing, if you will, to have someone who's lived in Afghanistan, traveled across Afghanistan both before and after war. Obviously, we were not around I was not around before war, so I mean it's refreshing to have that sort of perspective. And yeah, this is just an announcement to the viewers that we spoke about the need for independent media to speak truth to power, whether that power is political or psychological. In the instance of the media, that's exactly what we at AfghanEye want to do. We're not representing a particular political organization. We don't have a political agenda. Afghans like Mr. Faqiri and the others that we've had on our podcast, we've hosted at our own expense as freelancers. The coronavirus once again provides us many opportunities, but the saying is that there are always opportunities in a crisis. So please do follow us, like our Facebook page, follow us on Twitter, subscribe to our YouTube, and as well as that, Mr. Faqiri, if any of our viewers want to contact you or want to reach out to you, what is the best way in which what platform serves best for you?
The best way is through Twitter.
Yes.
Because my Facebook account has been disabled.
There we go.
Yeah, Facebook could not tolerate me anymore.
Free speech.
Yeah. So the only account I have is on Twitter. Twitter is my best way to reach me. And I would say that I really appreciate you guys. You're doing a very wonderful job, a very important job. This is very essential for the Afghans to know or to hear a different perspective on these issues, new perspective, one that challenges the dominant one, a new narrative, alternative media that we talked about. These are important things, and you are doing a great job. I have been following you through your previous discussions. I think these will take off, and we need this kind of platforms. Again, I really appreciate it. I'm very grateful to both of you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
The pleasure is ours. The pleasure is ours. Any words of advice?
Well, the only thing is that keep up the good work. Don't give up. Don't give in. I mean, you're doing the right thing. People will come to you and will scare you and will tell you that this is not the right way. But stay on your way. Be persistent. Believe in yourself. Believe in your cause, and try to be helpful to the Afghans. Afghans are one of the most unrepresented people on this planet. The most defenseless, the most weak people on this planet. And the Afghans are, because they are weak, they are defenseless. The US has picked up on them because they are a weak target, very weak target. And we must defend them. They need us. They really need your voice to defend the Afghan nations and their rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's wrap it up. Again, our viewers, everyone who's watching, thank you very much for supporting us. Those who have liked our pages and subscribed to our channels, thank you very much. And also some of the people who have donated to our Patreon page, we really appreciate your support. And until next time, wassalamu alaikum.